And with that, I will turn it over to Solutions IQ.
Thanks, Leanne. Welcome to today's presentation on Enterprise Agile Adoption. As Leanne mentioned, at the end of the live presentation, you'll receive an email with links to the recording and copies of the slides. At the end of the time we'll reserve time to answer your questions, but if you submit your questions online throughout the presentation using the GoToWebinar feature on your screen, that will help us queue them up for Brian. A little bit about our presenter today, Brian Stallings. He's our Director of Agile Management Practices here at Solutions IQ. He's a principal consultant, Agile coach, and one of the 100 or so certified Scrum trainers in the world. He has experience both as an employee, a user, and a consultant and coach with Agile, working with both small startups to very large multinationals, and he has trained and coached over 200 Scrum teams. Brian, take it away.
I guess it's afternoon and morning. Today we're going to talk a little bit about Agile adoption at the enterprise level, and some of the agenda items we want to discuss are here on the screen. You know, this can be a challenging thing for organizations. We're discussing when you move beyond a few teams, and those teams doing Agile, maybe on pilot projects or in some small part of the company, and the organization decides to do Agile practices everywhere. The benefits are becoming obvious to the organization, and they want to take advantage of that. So I want to discuss those challenges and then to talk about some approaches for resolving them, such as an organizational change program for bringing Agile into the organization. Now, I've been involved in several of these at a large scale, and so I'm going to talk us through a case study in the latter part of the presentation, one that I was involved in and that I think is a reasonable example. Then we should have plenty of time to talk about questions, which may be the most interesting part, the questions that you have. So to kind of get us started, I put together a bit of an introduction about what it's like at different stages in organizations as we get started with Agile. And you may be part at any point along this change curve that I'm going to suggest, where organizations begin at a grassroots level in many cases with maybe a team that's learned a bit about Agile and brings it into their practices on their own. Or they may not really understand all of the aspects, but they start with a few practices. And oftentimes that leads to a whole team learning about that set of practices and perhaps other teams becoming involved. And then what we're talking about now is growth beyond that to all teams within an organization. So change has to be cultivated, it has to be fostered, and those early efforts looked after and encouraged. We'll talk a little bit about early efforts to seed Agile and how we can ensure that it has an opportunity to grow within an organization. So again, just briefly, when organizations get started at the grassroots level, we face a specific set of challenges that are described here, and we work to overcome those, and oftentimes that leads to an awareness within our management about what's going on and what's different with Agile and what opportunities it provides. And as we overcome those challenges, that awareness allows us to move forward into other teams. You know, as Agile grows and we get several teams involved, we end up with a whole different set of challenges, and we become somewhat more mature in our Agile practices, where we're seeking to do more than just be a couple of individuals doing Agile or a single team doing Agile. Now, it's the growth beyond those couple of teams that this webinar is about, some of these enterprise challenges as we seek to be successful and bring Agile throughout the organization wherever it can benefit us. We're seeking those benefits rather than just the fact that we want to be Agile. Some of the enterprise challenges are described here, and we're going to discuss a few in depth. There's so many that we could discuss, and so I've selected a few that are, I think, critical that we're going to dig into a little bit deeper. But as you can see, we face a completely different set of challenges. Now, I have a concern as a coach, and having been an active practitioner in several organizations doing Agile wide scale, Agile where the leadership and the teams decided we want to take this everywhere. The challenges that we find is that Agile is, while it's very simple to understand, it can be very hard to do successfully. And it's deceptively simple. But with our organization and our culture, our politics, and people involved, a lot of complexity creeps in. And so as we work as advocates for Agile within our organizations to help us take steps up this curve, we don't do so in a straight line at all times. We make some progress that's incremental. Oh, let me step through this. Oh well. So if you look at this twisting curving line, what I mean to represent by it is sort of the way that we wander through the changes as we bring Agile into our individual practices and then into our teams. This could represent my personal story, years ago as we made some efforts to do some Agile practices, and we found some success, and then we found a pitfall, and we struggled again, and our degree of adoption or success would decline, and then, we would overcome that impediment or challenge, and we would make further steps and get greater success, and then we would stumble again, and it seemed like that we were constantly learning new things that were helping us, but there was so much that we didn't know and so many pitfalls that we weren't aware of that those struggles were critical, and sometimes they could have potentially caused us to choose not to do Agile any longer. So what was interesting in my experience is as we got into more and more teams, and I was part of an organization where we had 35 active Scrum teams, as we were growing, there was some things that the books and the websites and such didn't really help with. And I had an opportunity to work with Ken Schwaber and bring him into the organization where I was at for some consulting. And I truly believe that through that effort and things that we learned, we were able to avoid what I try to illustrate on this slide as this ticking time bomb. What I mean by that is there are some challenges that we could face where it's a pitfall. It becomes so great that the organization becomes dismayed with the attempts to do Agile and decide that perhaps it's too hard, something that we can't accomplish. If we were to take and stretch that twisting line out and show truly how far we had to come as we wended our way trying to figure out how to do Agile well, it was quite a bit more distance than if we could have just stayed on that curve. And it was the coaching, really, that helped us to more effectively stay on that curve and cease our wandering. And so I want to talk a little bit about the things that could be pitfalls so that as you cross into a full widespread adoption of Agile, you can consider those and eliminate them as early as you can. Now, what are some of those challenges that organizations are finding? Version 1 puts out a State of Agile Development survey every year, and this is data from the 2008 version. And what's interesting, if you look at some of the reasons that organizations say these are barriers to our further adoption of Agile, going beyond the team or several teams that we have, these things are challenges to us. And we find things here that we all struggle with: our organizational culture and inability to change, trying to find the right people who have Agile experience, and support from our management team. These are all some of the top issues that we find, and all items that we have to work and overcome as we try to drive Agile further into the organization. So with that little introduction, let's talk a bit about some of the challenges that I'm going to discuss today. I want to talk about how Agile is when you get Agile brought into an entire organization, it becomes pervasive organizational change. We start to talk within the organization about how we need to involve others besides just, let's say IT or the development organization or business, but we start to reach out to different parts of the organization like human resources or finance. And so we're going to discuss that in more detail. I want to also talk about what happens is you bring other teams into your Agile practices, and they don't always have the same level of success or competency in doing Agile, and you have a variety of teams, and they each are succeeding more or less. And how do you deal with that, and how do you help those teams? And then finally, I want to talk about the cross-functional aspects of adoption. What happens as we bump up against other parts of the organization, and we bring them in and into this what they perceive to be just an IT process change. So I'm going to jump into those. Let's talk about pervasive organizational change. I made the statement, when you go beyond a few teams, you end up with a lot of change within the organization. As a practitioner inside of organizations and as a coach now, I reach out and start to involve other parts of the organization, and they start to wonder initially why you're talking to us. Aren't you guys that are doing Agile, aren't you just part of making an IT process change? And we'll contact human resources and ask them to get involved, and they'll scratch their head a little bit, or finance, or marketing, or sales, or even the support function within IT, all because we're trying to help things occur that can change the organization, such as get the right infrastructure for the teams, or to make some transition from the way we may have funded our projects financially to an incremental funding model, or because we're trying to change the way that teams are reviewed from an individual perspective to a team perspective within HR. And even within sales, trying to help the organization prepare to talk to our customers differently about receiving our work and delivering our work in smaller releases, and how we need to do that work incrementally. And so it becomes important to communicate this message throughout the organization that this is pervasive change, that it's not a single change within IT, that to truly do Agile at the enterprise level, we need to get all of these organizations involved and understanding what the change is. And it's not that we're going to be changing them. We need them to be involved in the change. And we'll talk about that when we get into Agile adoption programs. So change is hard. It's a challenge for organizations and individuals. I was thinking about this as I was preparing to put this webinar on, and came across a couple of quotes that I put here about what change is for people and what it is for organizations. And it's a challenge as we're asked to participate in change because of the uncertainty that exists there. But in a business sense, it's critical that we are able to change as fast as possible, faster than our competition. I think about Jeff Sutherland, right, the guy who kind of got Scrum started, and what he says about one of the most recent organizations he's been a part of, about how Scrum enabled that company to use, as he terms it, the fire hose of technology, and to redirect the efforts of the entire organization at a competitive threat and to knock it down in a very short period of time, and then get back to their critical focus areas without any delay. And that it was that ability, and that the ability to deliver rapidly to the marketplace that allows those organizations that can do so to launch themselves into a leader position. As individuals consider change, this is a change model that I use with individuals. It's from Virginia Satir, and it helps as we discuss change with individuals for them to recognize the cycle that they're about to go through, that they find themselves in a comfortable place, in what this model calls the late status quo, comfortable with their experiences and their performances in a pretty narrow band, And as we go into a change process, we experience, as individuals going through change, some sort of foreign element, some new part of our work or life that throws us into this change cycle. And we resist that initially, and that brings us into a period of chaos where our performance is dramatically different, and it wavers quite a bit, and we struggle to understand and to sometimes struggle against the change. And it takes an understanding of what we're trying to accomplish, what we call a transforming idea, for us to start to come out of that cycle where we're struggling and resisting change. And that transforming idea or experience brings us through a period where we start to integrate this new aspect, this change, into how we work and live. And over time, we're able to make that integration happen. And then the result is the hope, the intent of the outcome would be that we can achieve some new status quo that has a position of performance that's even greater. And so, as a coach, as individuals in an organization who are advocating Agile, our goals would be to help individuals understand this cycle and to prepare and support them through it. Our goals would be to make that period of chaos be one that's shorter and where the variability is less, and perhaps whatever we can do to provide a new status quo that is at as high a performance point as possible. And these change cycles will repeat as we experience new and different aspects of a change program. And it can feel like a roller coaster ride, and we need to recognize that as we go through this process. Now, organizations go through change as well. And so I reference, there's a lot of different models out there, but I reference in this slide John Cotter's work on leading change and some of his suggestions about how we go through the change process. And with an understanding of Agile, we can even bring an Agile perspective into this cycle and make it less linear and prepare organizations to benefit from the way that Agile helps us to address change and integration of that change. So as we consider enterprise Agile adoption, we need to be prepared to support those individuals and the organization because these can both be critical time bombs that will cause us to deviate greatly from what our goals are and perhaps even prevent us from reaching them. So I want to jump into the second challenge. The first was that change is pervasive. Now, consider that you're coming to Agile with a number of teams in place, and they've been working together. Perhaps you've been doing some pilots, or you have a small part of your company, maybe a division that's learned about Agile, and the hope is that we could extend those benefits and experiences to other parts of the organization. Now, when you grow your Agile practices, you'll find that the competency in those teams will vary, and you're going to have, as we do in this example, some teams that are excelling and that are just finding that the Agile practice is something that they just it's just part of them, and they find success and they strive for that success. And you'll find other teams that struggle and are challenged, and the goals of the enterprise adoption program would be to figure out how do we first create teams that can be successful, and how do we support and coach them so that they can achieve that success. And, also, how do we ensure that we don't damage or detract from the success of the teams that are doing really well? One of the pitfalls that I made with the first organization where we learned to do Agile would be to look at some results like this and suggest that we should take Team 3 and Team 6 and take some of those really stellar Agile team members and distribute them in ways that would aid the other teams, all with good intentions, right, that we could create a better set of teams. And in that experience across 35 teams, we tried that several times, and the results were not what we expected. We essentially took apart some high-performing teams, and of course, they were more than just those stellar team members. There was something there when they worked together that when we distributed them wasn't there. And we ended up with a set of teams, that performed less well. So we started to use mentoring models and other approaches that would leave those teams together but allow them to influence the teams that were less successful. And as a coach, I spend a lot of my time thinking that the best place for me would be to work with these teams that are the lowest performers. And I had some guidance from my manager at the time, which was that sometimes we're going to have teams that just aren't going to get it. And it may be best for a coach to spend their time with some that are on the edge of getting it and helping them to become successful. And so that's something to consider as you look at the teams that you've got. What are the competencies that you have with your team? Are they just getting started? Are they just learning their skills? Do we need to provide them a lot of patience and support? What can we offer them so that they can, become more successful? What sort of coaching does it take? And how do we help lead them from those basic beginning practices to a place where they're strong and robust and mature in their use of Agile practices? I think it takes coaching, and I think an organization needs to find coaches or build coaches internally so that they can support those teams that are just getting started or that are struggling. So our third challenge is cross-functional adoption. If you look at this diagram, here we've got in the center of everything this representation of all of these different teams that are trying to be successful with Agile, some more than others, as our bar chart indicated. Now, as we get started with Agile and we try to grow it, we start to bump into all of these different functions. You've got impediments as a team that you're escalating and trying to resolve as you work with product management or the project office or with different parts of the organization. And this friction slows down the pace of adoption. Now, if those teams are left alone to try to be successful and there isn't greater support across all of these functions, and I mean more than that, not just trying to get those other functions on board, but I mean including those functions in this whole change process so that they are part of the desired change and so that they can assist in leading the change and so that they can advocate within their organization to change and truly understand the value that we're trying to achieve. This is really what organizational change management or operational change management is all about, as we try to put together an integrated program that involves all of these different functions and so that we understand truly where we're going. And so that brings us to a discussion about Agile adoption programs. Now, what I think about here when I think about program management from the aspect of pulling together really an assortment of projects that are seeking to make improvement within the organization. I'm not talking about the software projects that we have in place. That's where this program is going to have its effect. But I'm thinking more about this organizational or operational change program where we're looking at how do we change our organization and we're putting together the support and structure that's necessary for that organization to make the change. Now, there's a diversity of approaches. You can have top-down, bottom-up. You can have a mixture of how we might go about making that change happen. I've been part of organizations where we planted a few seeds and hoped that people would want to take advantage of more. And the indication is we're here if you ever need us. Agile's a good thing. If you're ever ready for it, let us know. And I've been part of organizations that were clear on the other end of the spectrum, where the enthusiasm for Agile was there, and it was an encouragement that we all get on board and participate and drink that Kool-Aid. So there's a diversity in between about how do we mix the top-down direction that we want to go with the bottom-up desire and involvement and the advocacy for Agile. So I want to talk about a pattern for Agile adoption at the enterprise level. And as we talk about this, we're going to discuss three different kinds of teams. the one that we know the best in the bottom left is our delivery team. This team of cross-functional development, tests, documentation, usability, all the folks that we might need to get our software done that are working in small cycles using the Scrum framework. And as they work, they're trying to, again, bumping up against some of these challenges, escalating their impediments, seeking the support of their leadership. We're also going to talk about that leadership, and I'm going to call them the enterprise adoption team, or sometimes we call it the enterprise action team, when we're trying to help that set of leaders understand their need to take action. And we'll talk a little bit about how to help them work in iterations as they seek to support their organization and as they seek to really function as a team across all of the different parts of that executive leadership, and how they can build a backlog of work. And we're going to talk about transformation teams. These are teams that are ad hoc, they're short-lived, they're put in place to solve specific impediments or needs or organizational change aspects. And as they make that progress and make change happen in the organization, then those teams and their purpose is, as it concludes, those teams conclude their work and perhaps move on to other change. So let me talk to you a little bit about how this model works. So we've got these Scrum product delivery teams, and the way that they get their backlogs put together is really directed from the vision and direction that the leadership is going. So you've got a leadership team that's got some software that they need to get built, and they ought to be working together to sort of provide a direction and a vision to the organization and to prioritize all the work that the organization could be doing. That leadership team needs to resolve impediments, needs to tackle some transformation initiatives related to Agile adoption and other changes as they try to grow their business, and they need to tackle some software projects that are part of how they serve their customers or improve their internal practices. All of that we can put together and prioritize in what we call an enterprise Agile adoption backlog. And this is all of the work within the organization, not just the work to adopt Agile, but the work of our day-to-day business. So that backlog can drive what goes out to our teams. And so here we've got a software team, for example, that gets a subset of that backlog. Help us build this product, right? And the team builds with the support of their product owner, builds a product backlog, and they start to do that work to deliver that software. Now, as the organization is trying to resolve some of these impediments, as they're trying to do some of the transformational work, let's say, for example, that review cycles come up and HR is accustomed to doing reviews in a very individual way, and the Agile teams identify that as an impediment and communicate that we need a team-based approach now. And so we structure a small transformation team. Maybe it has somebody from the teams, maybe it has some folks from HR, maybe some leader on the team, and that small team is working together to tackle that small backlog around the transformation initiative. And so the enterprise team can provide that backlog and provide representation that can function as a product owner to resolve that intended need, that transformation initiative. So you can see how the enterprise backlog that the leadership of the organization is prioritizing can function both to fill the backlog of software delivery teams and these transformation teams that are within the organization seeking to move us towards the practices that we want to incorporate as part of Agile. Now, we can grow this a little bit. We can add teams and provide greater progress towards completing that software backlog, provide more teams focused on transformation initiatives. Maybe we've got somebody working on the changes that we need for incremental funding or finance aspects, how we budget or how we leverage our tracking of metrics so that we can understand where we're at. Maybe we have a team that's working on infrastructure so that we can have the right team environment, so that we can get the right tools in place, so that we can leverage, let's say, video conferencing or other techniques within our teams. So as we grow this, it gets more complex, and there's a lot going on with the organization. We need to come together to coordinate our work and to make status decisions and to involve our leadership. And so we would want to, just like we would in an Agile practice, come together frequently, talk about what's been accomplished, make that transparent, plan together about where we're going next. So it's a simple approach, a team approach, to how we can bring Agile into an organization, both in creating our software delivery teams and tackling these transformation initiatives. This is a model that we've been using in many of our clients as we seek to bring Agile at a grander scale beyond just a few teams into the organization. And this diagram really represents that model, that enterprise Agile adoption framework, where we, and this could be leveraged in every case where you are seeking to make that change inside your organization as well. So inside of this diagram, we've got some of the functions that are important for making this change happen. So there's going to be a need to work within the organization to drive Scrum, and so we've got some coaching there for those teams to help the organization learn Agile development practices and some support and coaching and training there. We've got organizational change management competencies that are necessary, and then an opportunity to support and help the management team understand what changes are necessary and how we can involve them. Now, the framework really begins with discovery about what's going on in the organization and making that initial plan and baselining how we've started, and then deciding as an organization what we're trying to accomplish and where we're seeking to go with Agile, what maturity targets we have, and then putting together our program approach to solve those challenges, working within that organizational change model to involve all of these different constituencies within the organization to create a program that doesn't do things to people, doesn't force change on people, but that involves them in the change. And we create this enterprise adoption team and a backlog that we work then through iterations to deliver and make those changes happen within the organization. So I want to talk to you, that's great, Brian, we've got a model, but what does that look like? I was hoping to share that with you through this case study. So we're going to change the names. This company is actually referenced in Ken Schwaber's third book on the enterprise in Scrum, and he nicknamed it Tailspin. Again, he was involved a little bit, and so he understands some of what was happening there, and so I'll use that same name. Now, Tailspin is a financial services company, and they work in payment processing with large enterprises. And this organization piloted Scrum in 2006 with considerable success. They had, I think there's 5 teams that were doing Scrum initially. And based on those pilot results, they sought to drive Agile adoption throughout the organization, wide scale, and that was in 2007, 2008. Okay, so how did they approach Agile and getting things started? Well, this was their rollout goal in 2007. This was after their initial pilot. The goal was to develop sufficient Scrum teams and expertise across all lines of business so that our customer projects could be undertaken successfully and profitably using the Scrum framework. And the goal was to get to a penetration across teams of somewhere around 65 or 70%. We assumed that there would be some teams that wouldn't be ready to use Agile. There would be some technologies that we had in place that we didn't yet understand how to successfully do with Agile because of some of the legacy systems that we had. So an aggressive goal to accomplish in 1 year. And this is an actual image from a slide deck that was used in this organization as we first started talking about the pervasive aspect of change that comes from Agile adoption. So the impact would be diverse, and we shared this across the organization, that our prospects, our sales prospects, our clients, all of our Scrum project teams would all be involved, and would be bumping up and influencing all of these different parts of the organization. And literally every aspect of our business would need to understand what was being changed and cooperate and participate in that change. So a large-scale implementation to involve all of these different organizations. So we approached this using both what we understood about Agile practices to do things iteratively, as well as what the company was accustomed to when it came to organizational change. And we put together a program structure. And we looked across the organization to understand what involvement we would need to accomplish some of the changes and who we would get the support from. So this was a program sponsored from senior leadership, and we had some coaches that really played the program management role or really were responsible for this organizational change. And they had support from folks at every one of the sites. There was 4 different locations that were involved. And then we had this steering committee or this leadership team that we call the Enterprise Action Team. And their roles really with the leadership at each site plus the senior leadership was to provide direction and advice and cross-coordinate across all of the organization. I got to play the role of a program advisor. So then within the organization there were functions set up. So you could consider, for example, let's say you're somebody from human resources. You might be asked to participate on this second team, the organization design and human factors team. And this was just what we called it within this. Again, we're talking about a case study, not let's say a set of recommendations that I would suggest that every organization needs to consider. But folks who had real-time jobs, regular day-to-day work to do, were asked to spend a small amount of their time participating on one of these teams that's represented by each of these boxes so that we could put together across the organization practices for how we wanted the organization to look, from the technology tools that we had to the processes that we were using to how we would communicate across the organization about these changes, right? Program communication, communication from our leadership so that everybody could understand what was key and important about the program. Training and development, and with sales, go-to-market, with marketing, go-to-market conversations about how to talk to our customers differently. We had a whole coaching team that we were trying to build to support this transition. So this was our program structure, and as I showed you on the slide that talked about how do you work together incrementally, we each built backlogs and shared those across the organization to have our enterprise backlog, worked to prioritize those, and we met individually within our teams daily, and we coordinated across the organization for the program at a weekly level. So there's some slides in here to talk a little bit about what each of these different functions did, what their mission was, and I don't think it's necessary that we discuss each of them, but they'll be here if you're interested in what did the Agile Metrics and Reporting team or the Organizational Design and Human Factors team work on, what was the mission of the technology team. So review those afterward, and it'll help you understand sort of what we viewed were critical functions within this organizational change. Organization communications and what the training and development team did to prepare individuals and to coach, and go-to-market design. Each had a mission, and each group worked together to coordinate those activities. And as we've discussed in this simple team approach to Agile, we had that leadership team, we had software teams that were going through this process and being coached, and we had these transformation teams, each one of them that are in that organizational tree diagram that were involved for either the whole program or for different parts of it based on the changes that they were making. And those changes would be created, and then they would be spread throughout the organization. And bit by bit, and it took more than a year, bit by bit, we were able to make some good incremental change happen. So, I'm sorry, more animation. So, in summary of this model, it really helped us to tackle several different tracks within the organization. Each of the development teams had a life cycle that they needed to go through as we worked with them to coach them and support them in their efforts to incorporate Agile. And so it was a track of working with all of those teams as they were prepared and wanted to begin to use Agile practices. There was a track that involved the entire enterprise. How do we get the leadership involved? How do we help them prioritize all of the work of the organization and coordinate it in a way so that we could work from those priorities? There was a transformation teams track with all of these incremental changes that we needed to make. And then there was a whole track for training as we sought to involve everybody with training, the appropriate amount of training, whether it was multiple days so that we could bring people into an effective team environment, or whether it was just all employee education training so that you could be aware of what was happening within the organization as we were trying to keep this change out in front and make everybody aware of what was occurring in the organization so that they could get involved and participate and not be concerned or uncertain as the change moved forward. Now, again, this is another slide about the features and benefits that we found in that year's program. We used an Agile approach to Agile adoption, as I've described through that team model. We had embedded Agile experts. They were people who we had within our organization that were part of those initial pilots and had been doing Agile, in my case, for 3 years at that point. And we created a sustainable program that was going to take some time, and we were making progress and providing status. We had a weekly discussion with our leadership. We collected some data, did some surveys, all kinds of good things that would help us to work at a good sustainable program. Now, the benefits that the organization was looking for were accomplished through this program because it reduced the risk of scaling Agile within a large organization, and it helped us to address those challenges that we discussed at the beginning and provide us a way to measure progress and ensure that we were on track. And it was not perfect, let's say, but progress and the transparency and the approach that we took, as we all know, on a small Agile team helps a team to be successful, was effective at helping across the organization. Okay, I guess that's my summary. Now I'm going to take a look at some questions.
Thanks, Brian. We'll get to the questions with Brian a minute after he takes a drink and has a rest. But let's talk a little bit about Solutions IQ for those of you who may not know who we are. We provide a full spectrum of professional services for everything from Fortune 500 companies like AT&T, Chevron, Microsoft, along with smaller growth companies like Classmates.com and InfoSpace. We work together, of course, with our partners Version 1 to equip companies with the tools and knowledge that they need to succeed with Agile, and we work with companies at every stage of Agile adoption, starting with certification training or introductions to full enterprise-level management consulting services. What makes us different is that we develop software ourselves, and we do more working with teams to produce software than we do talking about that. Our Agile development teams augment and extend our clients' own development capability with Java and .NET expertise. We also do staffing. We started that way 30 years ago, and we supply T-Mobile and Microsoft and other companies with technology professionals on a continuing basis. So Brian said there's companies at all stages of adoption. Many of you are getting started understanding Agile practices and experimenting, and others have adopted at the team level, and now you're trying to understand how to implement Agile more broadly. Some of the questions you've asked touch on some of the things Brian talked about today and things that might come up as you're trying to adopt Agile. So Brian, can we go with the first question, please?
Sure. So we have a question from Aldeep Gupta that talks about what's the typical time frame as we go from grassroots to full-scale, widespread adoption. It's a good question. You could languish in grassroots effort for quite a while. I'm acquainted with an organization here in the Seattle area that one of the managers started to introduce practices to their team. Didn't really ever use the word Agile, just suggested we try some things that seemed to be good practices, and over a couple of years, the team leveraged all those practices and put together, suddenly they were 2 years later realizing they were developing in a completely different way. And that was at the point where they were told, well, what we've been working to do is bring Agile into the organization. So it's hard to really put a time frame on that, but I think the time frame between what it takes to go grassroots to widespread, once you have grassroots in place, you're really looking at your organization and what style of an organization you have. I have a friend who works in a very large insurance company, and as they plan their organization's enterprise adoption, their time frame is 10 years. And to me, that just seems like forever. The organizations that are more nimble that I work with, their time frame is 18 months to 2 years. And so I think it depends on what sort of an organization you're a part of. I've had the opportunity and the pleasure to work with some startups that don't really have a lot of history on how they've done work in the past, and they've got a lot of people anxious to try new approaches, and we find them able to make Agile part of their company's culture very quickly. And you may be talking about 3 or 4 months. Salesforce.com is a good example of an organization that talks about how their Agile adoption went over a 3-month, very intense period. So that's sort of what I can say about that.
Brian, Winnie Gibson asks, what's the role of the PMO in enterprise Agile adoption?
Well, in the case study that I shared, we were fortunate to have the kind of PMO that, we had a few struggles initially, but they came to a point where they viewed their role as a team that could really lay the foundation for other teams' success. And so they changed from someone who the organization might have considered sort of a process police and someone who was seeking to verify whether or not you were following their traditional practice to a team that was focused on mentoring others on good practices. So I saw them put together, for example, some simple templates that teams could use for user stories or for burn down charts or sprint backlogs. And they made these available on a community site. And they hosted meetings weekly and provided some coaching and support as those teams tried to learn Agile. They became a big advocate for us as Agile coaches to enable the teams to be successful. I think that was a very effective role. They also provided some reporting at the enterprise level about what was happening across all of the teams, but they got out of the way when it came to teams reporting their own progress. And so I think that's an effective role.
Sam Schroeder and Eldeep Gupta ask questions around metrics. Eldeep asks, what are examples of baseline performance metrics and reporting? And Sam asks, what metrics did you define for measuring your success in Agile adoption? For example, subjective surveys with teams or analysis of quantitative metrics?
Okay. So baseline performance metrics, we had to go with what the organization could provide because they'd been using technical practices and that were different than the ones we were using as we began to do Agile. So essentially we wanted to understand how was their quality? How did they manage quality? What was the time frame that it took for them to deliver work? What was their throughput? What was the frequency of their releases? What was the satisfaction level of their teams? What was the time frame it took for them to conceive of a need and deliver that to a customer? And that's a sort of a beginning. If you want to understand more about some of these beginning metrics, there's a webinar that was done a couple months back, again by Solutions IQ in version 1, that talks about metrics and how to get started. And it goes into more detail. I think it would be helpful. So we had to start with that set of baseline metrics, and then we tied them to some of the Agile metrics that we were using within the program so that we could say later, our throughput used to be, it took us 8 months to get a feature from concept to cache, and now we're able to do that in a month, let's say. The second part of the question on metrics was about how do you define some metrics measuring our success with Agile adoption. And we did use surveys. We did survey the organization as we entered the pilot process. And again, as we completed the pilot process, we checked with the teams. And then we used this survey across the organization. We were looking for how it might change employee engagement. And it was interesting. We tracked it by department. We could tell which departments were really thrilled. And we had one department that was not happy. And this was revealing to us, this was the downstream department, the one who was seeking to put new software into production at the operational level. And the challenge there was nobody had involved them, which was a failure we found, early enough so that they could be prepared for this wave of all this new software that's coming. And so Agile to them meant that they were having to do a whole lot more work. And so we made some good changes there.
Well, we have one more question relating to measurement from Mark Poulin. How is Agile competency measured?
You know, here at Solutions IQ, it's kind of been a debated question, frankly. We've been reading and understanding what people have to say about maturity models for Agile, and I think our sentiment is that it's hard to choose one, and it's hard to really see that they could be all that effective, except when you talk to a set of leaders who look at all that's possible as you seek maturity with Agile, as you seek competency with Agile, and they need to make trade-off decisions about to what level do we want to go at this point. And so even something as simple as this first change curve that I showed, you know, where are we trying to go now beyond our grassroots efforts? Do we want to seek the benefits of doing Agile in a few teams or to take it broader than that? And so that's we've discussed some of those models, and I think the discussion is still going on. From a competency perspective about teams, we look at practices and their effectiveness with those practices. And for me, it's all about whether a team can commit and deliver, whether a team can set a reasonable definition of done, and whether their practices are such that they consistently meet it. And you know, if they can keep all of their practices and efforts transparent. They're going to encounter difficulties, and do they make the news about those findings available to their leadership and their product owner? And those are some of the assessments that we would look at as coaches to understand where we could help and coach teams.
Mark also asks, with regard to organizational change, that's what we've been talking about here, does the organizational structure usually also change?
You know, I used the term operational change at one point or another in the presentation, partly because one of the challenges when you go into an organization and you talk about organizational change is what they're accustomed to hearing, and what it so often means is we're going to come and do something to your organization. We're going to shift jobs around. We're going to eliminate some jobs. We're going to restructure. And that's really not what a group of Agile coaches do when they help an organization, whether they're internal coaches or external coaches. They're there really to help the organization look at the benefits that they seek and to understand how Agile might help them achieve some of those benefits. So we find that organizations change to accommodate those desired benefits. And so you may find, for example, that in our case, when I first started to do Agile, we grew from 6 development teams to 35. Our traditional approach would have been that we needed to grow several directors and perhaps another VP in order to accommodate the support for all of those people. However, Agile practices and Scrum made it possible for those teams to be very self-managing, and so the span of control changed and our organizational structure changed. So I think you do find those changes, and they're more related to some of the common sense reasons about how you would support your organization and teams, and really less about what Agile would force or cause to change within the organization. Michael's saying it's about time to finish.
We have time for one last question, which can't be answered in the time we have left, so see what you can do. Mariola Ionic asks, 50% of my team is offshore. Can Agile still work?
Well, you know, I've worked with teams that were spread around and continue to do so. And, you know, I was teaching a Scrum Master class yesterday, and I shared with the team when they asked the same question, you know, we're just so distributed. It doesn't seem like this would work for us. Can we do Agile well? And I said, perhaps Agile is the best way to do distributed development, but distributed development isn't the best way to do Agile. And so there's some cost there. There's, we might say, a tax